My name is Harriet Wims, and I'm part of the team behind the planning of this series. It is my pleasure this evening to welcome you to our virtual program and introduce our speakers. A couple of weeks ago, you may have heard Abe Kronsberg, the individual who has been a driving force behind this entire series, introduce me at a presentation about racial profiling in Jewish spaces. Abe has shown up as an ally and as a true friend to me. And so it gives me great pleasure to do the honor to introduce Abe along with his co-moderator and experts for this program. Abram Kronsberg is a congregant of Hizakumuna Congregation and a member of the Board of Trustees at the Jewish Museum of Maryland. Gail Lipsitz is a literature teacher and writer. She was coordinator of marketing and community relations at Jewish Community Services for 27 years, and her son David is a graduate of the Krieger Schechter Day School. Ari Y. Kelman is the inaugural holder of the Jim Joseph Professorship in Education and Jewish Studies at the Stanford Graduate School of Education, where he is the director of the concentration in Education and Jewish Studies and serves as the director of the Berman Jewish Policy Archive at Stanford. He has authored many books about American Jewish life and culture, including Station Identification, A Cultural History of Jewish Radio, and Shout to the Lord, Making Worship Music in Evangelical America. His research explores the forms and practices of religious transmission, and it's taken him to church, to Krakow, Poland, and to many, many B'nai Mitzvah, and deep into the archives of religious music of the early 1970s. Aaron J. Hahn Tapper, the May and Benjamin Swig Professor in Jewish Studies and the founding director of the Swig Program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, has been at the University of San Francisco since 2007. An educator for more than 2 decades, his primary academic interest is the intersection between identity formation, social justice, and marginalized groups. In 2003, he founded Abraham's Vision, a conflict transformation organization that ran educational programs within and between Muslim, Jewish, Palestinian, and Israeli communities. Currently, he is the executive director of the Center for Transformative Education, an educational initiative aiming to create empowering educational programs to transform societies into their potential, which he co-founded in 2008. Abe and Gail, I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. And tonight we're going to start with the term Jews of color, which we have used throughout our series, and we are now using for our discussion today. There is no general agreement on what that term means. For the purpose of enabling our audience to follow the discussion, how would the two of you like them to understand who is a Jew of color?
So first off, Ari and I just wanted to thank all of you thank you for inviting us, and thank everyone who is part of this Zoom webinar for being interested in this topic. In many ways, Ari and I are going to try to speak in one voice about tonight's responses to these questions that Abe and Gail are going to be posing. So the first question, defining or what is a Jew of color? You know, first we'd have to unpack what is a Jew, right? And then we can get to the of color part. Now, obviously, this series is focusing on the of color part more than the Jew part, but part and parcel to answering what is a Jew of color, you know, one would first need to unpack what is a Jew. And all of us know how complicated the answer to that question is, whether or not someone's responding, well, it's my culture, it's my religion, it's my heritage, it's my ethnicity, it's my race, right? There's so many different ways. to respond. And Ari and I aren't going to define what a Jew is tonight. We're also not going to define what a person of color is tonight in that same venue. Meaning, if someone asked us, all right, tonight we're going to speak about Jewish denominations. All right, well, I'm not going to define what a conservative Jew is, or an Orthodox Jew, or a Reformed Jew, right? I can offer definitions. I can offer potential ways of responding to that. But as what we're going to be focusing on tonight is Ari and I are going to do a deep dive, but also kind of a bird's eye view of the studies that have been conducted by and large, Jewish federations, Jewish institutions around the country about their Jewish populations, and to what extent those studies even touch on the notion of a Jew of color.
Ari?
Right. So to follow up on Aaron, first of all, thank you all for having us. We're pleased to be here. Thanks to the staff of the Jewish Museum as well for making this run as seamlessly as it will. But the reason that Aaron and I are here, I think I want to just take a step back. The reason that Aaron and I are here, we are not Jews of color, neither of us, but we're here because we've looked at systematically all of the Jewish community studies that have been undertaken since the year 2000 to understand how those studies, how the ways in which Jewish institutions, Jewish communities count themselves and define themselves. And we've tried to understand how those studies have sought to count or not count, as the case may be, people who self-identify as Jews of color. And so for me, the question, how do we define Jews of color? I'm with Aaron on this. It's not our place to define, and actually standard practice in population studies and in sociological studies of this kind is self-definition. So just as if I said, well, what denomination do you belong to follow on Aaron's, or what's your gender? I wouldn't, as someone who would write these surveys, a conservative Jew is this, an Orthodox Jew is this, or a Reformed Jew is this, which do you fall into? I would say, what's your denomination? I wouldn't prescribe gender either. I would say, what's your gender? So, and then I would give a bunch of choices as to what that might be. So in the same way, Aaron and I were not going into this with a normative definition of Jews of color and who they are and how they identify. We were looking at the surveys and how the surveys made certain assumptions about the variety of Jewish identities in our communities.
Let me ask you a different sort of a question. How do you respond to the white Jewish person who says, I don't see Jews of color in my neighborhood or at my synagogue, so there must not be any? In other words, why do you think the Jews of color have been invisible to the larger white Jewish community?
So I'm going to give a few different responses to that. The first one would be for those people who attend synagogue, which is obviously a subsection of American Jews. I would assume if anyone participating in this webinar went to synagogue, they know that not everyone in their Jewish community who belongs to that synagogue is present at the synagogue, right? That they know, oh, well, those are the people I see at synagogue. I know hundreds of other people who belong to the synagogue, meaning there's an assumption that the people who are there do not represent all of the people who belong to that community, right? So that's number one, meaning if you don't see those people, that doesn't mean they don't exist. That means those people, whatever those people are, aren't attending the functions that you are attending. All right, so that's one response. Another response is, another piece of that, for instance, a quicker one would be if you walked into an Orthodox synagogue and, depending on the mechitza, depending on the separation barrier between males and females that they have set up in the Orthodox synagogue, one could say, well, I might say, where's all the women, right? Just because I don't see them doesn't mean they're not there, okay? It's kind of part and parcel to that first response. Second response would be, we commonly don't see things that don't relate to our identities. And we commonly see things that do relate to our identities, meaning it's not uncommon for white Jews, Ashkenazi white Jews, to not see Jews of color because a lot of times they're assuming that people of color are not Jewish. That if you see someone who's Black, there's this assumption that that person isn't Jewish. Or if I'm tuned in, for instance, recently, my daughter happened to be part of something, the city of San Jose wanted someone from the local Jewish day school to come speak about Hanukkah. Now, the channel, they set up in somebody's living room, and it was supposed to be a non-denominational vis-a-vis religion setting, right? It's the holidays that are observed in San Jose. And as it was described to me, is that it was a very Christian setting, right? Now, but there was someone who was brought in to speak about Hanukkah. There was someone who was brought in to speak about Kwanzaa. My guess is that the people who set up that room did their best. But my guess is also that they were Christian. And that speaks to simply people with dominant identities are commonly not in touch with those of minority identities. If this is a dominant Christian country from its foundation through today, me as a Jew, I am much more in tune with Christianity and how it pervades our society than I would imagine most Christians are. So there's something about dominance and majority and minority and how that works out. That people, if you're not a person of color, you're probably not tuned in. But I'd say the last response, and there's many more, would be something that's called inattentional blindness. So there was a study done a number of years back by two Harvard sociologists, psychologists, and they measured how many times people saw something, right? So there was a minute-long video, and these people were passing basketballs to one another, and you were supposed to count how many times the people wearing dark shirts were passing the balls, how many times the people wearing light shirts were passing the basketballs. In the middle of this video, a person dressed up as a gorilla walks into the middle of the frame. Now, they did this study across different ethnicities, nationalities, gender, religions, sexual orientation, whatever the social identity category. And roughly 50% of people, regardless of their social identities, did not see the gorilla. Now, if you see this video, going into it that there's going to be a gorilla that walks in, you would be astounded that somebody walked in, didn't see the gorilla that was literally right in front of you. But it's called inattentional blindness in their study. I would also call it, when we're talking about race, I would talk about it in terms of bias or prejudice, right? We're sensitized to certain things and we're not sensitized to other things, largely, not entirely, but largely related to our own identities. So simply because we don't see something does not mean it's not there. More often than not, it means that we're not tuned into something.
Gail, I want to turn this over to you now so that we can talk a little bit about existing Jewish population studies.
Yes, let's talk about the importance of these population studies of Jewish communities, particularly for Jews of color. Aaron, could you tell us why the Jewish community needs an accurate count of Jews of color?
Yes, of course. We need the same reason that the US Census is carried out every 10 years. In theory, the goal is to figure out how many people who identify as X, Y, and Z there are so that they can allocate funding for people who have different needs, right? So in any given Jewish community, it's important to know how many children are there, how many preschool kids, how many primary school kids, how many high school age, because people at different ages have different needs. How many retired people are there? How many people are there who are in their 80s and 90s? How many people are there who use wheelchairs? Whatever the data set is trying to represent, and you're trying to find out how many of people have these identities, it's because you're trying to figure out what their needs are. And Jews of color have different needs than white Jews that are largely connected to the fact that they aren't white. because we live in a white majority and a society that has been built on, in many ways, I would say, white supremacy. So Jews of color have particular needs in the same way that any group with any particular identities have particular needs, and their needs are different than Jews who are not of color. And we need to figure out, as an institutional Jewish world, how many people there are of particular identities so we can meet people's needs, so they feel respected and they feel part of the Jewish community as opposed to feeling marginalized by the Jewish community.
Thank you. So Jewish population studies are used by Jewish philanthropic organizations, as you've said, to determine future funding for priorities within Jewish communities. Ari, would you talk about what sources of information are used to compile these studies, and what's the impact of the use of those sources of information on the count of Jews of color?
Sure. Thanks so much, Gail. I want to apologize for one quick thing. That is, I said that Aaron and I studied this topic in great depth. We did so with my colleague, Aaliyah Saperstein, who's in the sociology department at Stanford. And she was an integral part of this team. And I forgot to mention her before, and I wanted to give her proper credit here. So the sources, the way that these studies work, basically, and they work similarly in every community. I know that Baltimore just undertook one last year, is usually the Federation, the Associated, in your case, determines that it's been many years since they did their last survey. They need a better understanding of their community. Gail, as you said, these are used to help make allocation decisions about resources, human resources, financial resources, and so on in the community. And so the Associated, I imagine, the leadership of the Associated said, we need to understand our community better. Let's do a community study. Usually there's a request for proposals that goes out. In the United States, there's 3 or 4 different kind of groups that do this kind of demographic work in the Jewish community. Usually they write proposals. The Federation, the Associated, accepts the proposals, and then there's a period in which usually kind of a task force or committee in the Federation or in the Associated works with the researchers, and they decide, well, we're going to have a survey that's 30 minutes long. We can only have nobody's going to fill out a survey that's longer than 30 minutes. So how many questions can we cram into 30 minutes? And what are the questions that we get to ask in those 30 minutes? And what are the questions that we don't ask? So I was an advisor, a very low level advisor on the San Francisco 2017 and population study. We had a very long set of conversations where we said, well, we can ask this question and we can't ask this question because there isn't room for it in the study. So then you end up with a survey, X number of questions. And I will say that as somebody who studies American Jewry, surveys are an operationalized example of the values of a community. That is to say, as Aaron was saying before, it's an indicator of the opinions, attitudes, behaviors that are deemed significant enough to dedicate time and space for within a survey by the Federation / Associated and the researchers. And what's included is as important as what's not included. They then go about trying to get a representative sample of the community, and that's done in a couple of different ways. Sometimes it's done by looking at donor rolls to the Federation or the Associated, synagogue membership rolls. Sometimes it's done by something called distinctive Jewish names, DJN as it's known, which is people who they go through the phone book, or what they used to go through the phone book, people that had distinctive Jewish names, and they call those people, and then they're given the survey. The survey is administered to them. The number of people who respond to the survey is then weighted against what we know about American Jewry and what we know about Baltimore populations in general. Then it's sort of calculated to make sure that it's not, they got a decent sample, they got a representative sample. And then the results are tallied and put in reports to the community. So the key pieces are the writing of the survey, as I understand, the writing of the survey and the cultivation of the sample. The rest is just a lot of math.
So what is the impact of these sources of information on the count of specifically Jews of color?
Well, I mean, there's no impact on the count. The question for us, the question that got us interested, was how do these surveys attempt to account for racial and ethnic diversity in the American Jewish communities? And what we found through a systematic study of all 76 population studies that had been undertaken, these are community studies, these aren't national studies, so this isn't Pew or the National Jewish Population Study. These are community studies. There were 76 that were undertaken between the year 2000 and the year 2020. And we found, much to our surprise, we were not expecting to find this actually, that the majority of them, 35 of the studies, did not even ask a single question about racial or ethnic identity. 31 studies of the 76 had at least one question that asked about racial or ethnic identity. Of those 31, 3 of them included only one question, and that one question was, are you a Sephardi Jew? So that leaves really 28 questions that asked some version, 28 studies out of 76 that asked a question about the racial or ethnic identities of their respondents. I'll say by way of, so already we're getting a sense that of these community studies, which drive tremendous resource allocation and community planning decisions, because they influence community planning. We have a portrait of American Jewish communities in which the decision to ask a question about the racial or ethnic identity of the members of that community was deemed not important enough to even ask about in the majority of cases. So already there's a sort of distortion happening in the community portraits that are produced by these studies based on the questions that are asked, the questions that are not asked.
One little minutia just to correct, it was that the studies we looked at, there were 76, like Ari said, there were 45 that didn't ask a question related to whether or not the person was a person of color. And only 31 did, but of those 31, 3 only asked, are you Sephardi? And then that got it down to 28, et cetera. For anyone who's paying attention to these numbers.
Sorry about that. Yeah, 45, not 35.
Thank you. So Ari, perhaps you could continue to add on to that a little bit. What do these existing studies that you both examined tell us about the composition and size of the population of Jews of color, both in the United States and in Baltimore?
So they don't tell us much. The problem that we discovered is they don't tell us much, because in order to find out, you have to first ask the question. So if 45 of the 76 studies didn't even ask the question, we literally have no idea. And then if we take the 3 studies that asked if they're Sephardi, we know that there's some members of those communities who identify as Sephardi, but we don't know anything about the rest of that community and how they identify. Only 18 of the studies offered white as a response option. So only in 18 of the communities do we even know which of the Jews of that community identify as white, to say nothing of Latinx, African American, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Native American, and so on. And so the problem that we discovered in doing this systematic review of these 76 studies was that we don't actually have any reliable data set about Jews of color in these communities. And then if we take a look at the 31 studies that did ask a question, there's tremendous variety amongst them about how they ask the question. And if you're a survey geek like me, and you pay a lot of attention to the survey methodologies, how one asks a question in a survey can deeply influence how the respondents answer that question. And so the differences are not just semantic, although they are semantic, but they're not just semantic. They actually have important effects in the ways that respondents respond to them. So in the Baltimore example, Baltimore had one question in its study. Let me get the exact words from the question. The question was, do you identify as a person of color? That was the question. Other studies had, the census has 2 questions. They use a 2-question approach. One is about if you're Hispanic or Latinx, and the other is what your race is, and the races are sort of codified. So the census uses a 2-question approach. Baltimore had 1 question. Many others had different versions of the question. So in Boston 2005, they said, what race or races do you consider yourself to be? And then they gave a list of options. Portland, Oregon in 2009 asked, what's your ancestral heritage? Cleveland 2011, and I'm just picking these out because they're illustrative of the patterns, and Baltimore's as well. There's a small number that have started using the phrase person of color, although as Aaron said at the top, that phrase is itself not quite stable. And it's the source of some discussion about its meaning and application. So Cleveland in 2011 said, regarding your ethnicity, do you consider yourself white, Hispanic, Black, African American, and so on? And so even within the surveys that ask questions, the variety of wording changed a great deal, which means that if I was to say, well, let's see if I can combine, a study of the Cleveland Jewish population with a study of the Austin, Texas Jewish population and see how many Jews of color exist in those communities, I couldn't do it because the ways they asked the questions were so different that the differences in the answers would also not allow me to create any consistent read of the size or qualities of the community of Jews of color.
If I could just step in, there's two things that we want to drive home. One is what Ari's been saying, which is that there's no consistency across these 76 studies. Even put aside that 45 didn't even ask, right? The other 31, there's no consistency. That's one thing I really want to drive home. Second thing is there are national criteria of ways to ask these questions, which Ari touched on. The two-question format that's embedded in the current US Census is more or less a general rule of thumb that's what you should do. It has its own limitations, no doubt, but that is a federal standard that is commonly adhered to outside the Jewish community who conduct these things. Another thing I want to hone in on is the Federation or the Associated in Baltimore, they outsource these studies, right? As Ari was describing, no one at the Federation or the Associated well, there might be somebody, but in general, there's no trained demographers, and that's their job at the Associated or at the Federation. That's what they do. They put together these studies. As Ari said, there's 3 or 4, a few other groups, main usual suspects that federations go to. So in a sense, we're critiquing how these studies are done by those groups. Last thing I want to drive home is something that Ari said. I'm just going to put it in different words. The questions that are asked create the reality, right? Meaning we think commonly, if I'm a member of X community, the Jewish community in this case, so, okay, the demographic study is going to tell me the demographic composition of the Jewish community where I live. But it's actually, no. What it will show is a representation of the responses of the questions that were asked. That's really what it shows, right? That the questions themselves, the surveys themselves create reality in many ways. We assume that the survey reflects reality, but that's a false assumption. The surveys are actually creating reality based on, as Ari explained, all right, we don't have enough time, so we're going to ask this question, not that question. And then it creates the patterns, and we say, oh, well, we don't, that community, they're part of that sub-community of Jews, we didn't even ask the question, so how can we say they don't exist?
I actually want to follow up on that, if I might, for a minute. If I were a Jew of color, I think the question that would come to me would be, on the one hand, it seems to me you're saying that the lay leadership and the Associated really can't be held responsible for, or in any Jewish federation, for how the survey is being put together. So that sort of leaves, on the other hand, the academics who are working on these studies to bring to the attention of the leadership things that might be missing. And one of the things that appears to be missing, according to your critique, really is a lot of thoughtfulness that should be going into the whole of the community, not just a portion.
So I want to, I think the beauty of this kind of partnership, when it works really well, is that the researchers who don't necessarily live in the community have an expertise in research. The community leadership has an expertise in the community. They know things about neighborhoods. They know things about the culture of the place. And ideally, the way it works is that you get the expertise of the researchers in their methodology and their approaches, and you get the expertise of the community, and together you create a survey that is excellent both in its methodology and excellent in its understanding of the research, because the research is only valuable if it's, I mean, from the position of the associate or the federation, the research is only valuable if it helps them do their work better in the community. That's what makes the research valuable. It's not a kind of basic, they're not doing the study because they're kind of interested in a generic way in the Jews of Baltimore. They're trying to plan for the future of the Jews of Baltimore. It says that in the report on the front page, and not just in Baltimore. Every report opens with a letter from usually the president saying, here's why we did this, and here's why we think it's important. So, and by the way, just to be clear about this isn't a referendum on the Associated study, and it's not a referendum on the Baltimore Jewish community. In our analysis, the community portrait of Baltimore was typical of community portraits of other communities, both in the process and in the product. And so I don't blame the researchers. I don't blame the leaders of the community. And the issue here isn't about blaming particular individuals either. It's really about highlighting the ways in which questions about the racial and ethnic diversity in the American Jewish community are kind of consistently marginalized and consistently diminished, such that your first question, Abe, about like, well, why don't I see anybody at synagogue, right? Is in part a product of this way of going into trying to produce these community portraits. And that's frequently what they're frequently called, community portraits. And what we have is a distorted representation of the lives of Jewish people in Baltimore because of questions that are asked or not asked. Another example I could point to is the American Jewish study, the portrait of American Jewry from 2013 that the Pew Research Center did, which I think is an outstanding study in a lot of ways. But they didn't ask if there were GLBTQI Jews. That's not a question in the study. So it would be foolish for us to say, oh, well, there's no GLBTQI Jews in America, see, because they're not in the Pew study, and the Pew is the best national study that we have. But the omission of that question robs the Jewish community of an opportunity to really understand its own internal diversity.
If I could jump in, there's when we get back to how do these surveys how are they put together and what questions are left out, all of us have blind spots. All of us have unintentional blindness, all of us, including absolutely me. When I had surgery on my foot a couple years ago. And when I returned to campus, all of a sudden, for the next 3 months, I had insight into what it was like to be non-able-bodied in terms of walking. Now, only a little bit of insight because I knew it was temporary, et cetera. But all of a sudden, I realized how poor the physical infrastructure was of my campus in terms of somebody using not a wheelchair, but kind of a wheelie thing, right? We brought someone to campus a couple years ago at the University of San Francisco, Rabbi Watts Belser. I believe she's still teaching at Georgetown. She spoke about the portion from the Torah, the Parsha, the section of Torah about Noah. And she spoke about the ark. And she approached it from what it was like, what it would be like if you were a wheelchair user, right? That never even crossed my mind for a variety of reasons, many gaps in my purview. But she is a wheelchair user, and she was thinking about, all right, well, how would we get people onto the ship? How would we get people onto Noah's Ark? Part of the problem is that we, Jewish community, Jewish institutional world, in this particular case, need to be open to the fact that we have blind spots. And if we're really going to be inclusive, we need to invite more people with different non-normative, so to speak, identities, marginalized identities, and bring them to the conversation so we can ask the right questions. And it's part of the problem is even at the stage of asking the questions. And it's that important that we bring somebody who has this ability or lack of ability of this, that, or the other, or their social identity related to race, ethnicity, et cetera, gender, because that's the world is diverse.
Gail, I think we ought to head now to our conclusion. In terms of the amount of time we've got left, we want to get to our questions soon.
Right. If I may just ask one question that wasn't on our list, I'm feeling sort of as if the burden is on Jews of color to identify themselves, at least in a lot of these surveys, and that. So I'm very grateful that in your research, you're pointing out some of the flaws or what's been left out of these surveys that don't even give Jews of color a chance to identify themselves as part of the community. So Ari, this is for you, and then Aaron, I'll ask you. Based on the research that you've studied, how do you anticipate the demography of the American Jewish community will change over the next 10 to 30 years? We could ask that other question too, but that's not pertinent. You need to unmute.
Apologies for that. The makeup of the American population in general is trending toward greater diversity. And American Jews will probably follow that trend. In the cities where we do have sort of the most accurate data, say New York and San Francisco. New York was a 2011 study, San Francisco was a 2017 study. We saw more people identifying as Jews of color in the younger generations. That is, the younger you go, the bigger the count goes. We saw that in both of those cities. Those cities are not representative of the United States, but I'm saying as far as the pattern of more diversity in younger Americans that we're seeing, the Jewish community is following that pattern. There's no indication that that is going to shift course, right? I think we're going to continue to see that. And there's probably a bunch of reasons for that, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A if you wish. So I think the American Jewish community is going to continue to diversify. One measure of that, as evidenced by this conversation, is the moment that we're in where the American Jewish community, communities like yours, like mine, is beginning to have conversations about what it is to be more representative of the true diversity of American Jewry. But we're really just at the beginning of that conversation. The other one, and the dynamic is reciprocal, right? The more we pay attention to racial and ethnic diversity, the less surprised we are that it happens. Probably all of you have seen the David Diggs video about the Puppy for Hanukkah song. It's been on nonstop in my house, thanks to my 7-year-old, right? But that we have this kind of pretty amazing Hanukkah song in which all the kids, I think, are people of color, is kind of an incredible statement about where American Jews are at this moment, and probably wouldn't have happened, at least not, probably wouldn't have happened quite as it did, a decade ago. So the more we pay attention to them, the more we understand that it's an important element of our own Jewish communities. The diversity is, racial and ethnic diversity is an important element of our own Jewish communities. The more they're going to be, those aspects of our own communities, our own community compositions are going to be part of community development, community planning, community leadership, boards of synagogues, of organizations, of federations are going to diversify, and we'll see a greater diversity of a greater racial and ethnic diversity among American Jews, I think, into the future. The first step, or one of the first steps, or at least a fairly easy step to take, is if we're looking at how community portraits are produced, let's just ask the questions.
Mm-hmm. And that segues into our last formal question, which I'll pose to you, Aaron. How, and going back to the whole theme of this session, how can we make sure that Jews of color are not only counted, but count?
Part of it is such things as these surveys. Part of it has to do with people with dominant identities. In this particular case, in the United States in 21st century, i.e. whites, Ashkenazi white Jews, doing more work, frankly, on our selves in regard to what our blind spots are, especially our racial and ethnic blind spots. And as Ari said, you know, I'll even take it a step further. He said, probably the demographic changes, they're going in this direction. I'll say they are going in that direction because I'm not as much of an expert as him. So I can just, you know, say that. Meaning that we know the surveys out there of in 2050, the racial and ethnic composition of the United States of America will be much more racially diverse. And historically, the places where Jews live, usually the phenomenon that happen within the Jewish community is reflective of what's taking place in the broader non-Jewish community at that time, right? Put aside the state of Israel in terms of being a Jewish majority country. Every other place in the world, things that happen in the Jewish community, it's because they were happening in the non-Jewish community and they trickled down into the Jewish community, or Jews were part of those non-Jewish decisions per se. So the fact that this is the direction a racial composition is going in terms of diversity in the United States, there's absolutely every reason to think that's exactly the same trend within the Jewish community. But part of it is, you know, the dynamic is reciprocal, meaning the more we pay attention to racial and ethnic identities of American Jews, the more those identities will be accepted by the Ashkenazi white majority. So that there's this chicken and egg piece. We have to ask the questions to get the answers. And we have to be open to the fact that, oh, okay, that study, let's improve on it this time. If we look at LGBTQIQ, queer Jewish communities, things have only really started in terms of, say, scholarship or in terms of pop cultural movies within the Jewish community in the last 20 years, meaning we're at the beginning of even tapping into that. We're only at the beginning of really touching on, there's Jews of color in my community. It's really nascent, and we need to be mindful of that we're going to stumble and we're going to make mistakes. And, you know, the people like this overall speaker series, not tonight, but this overall speaker series includes all of these Jews of color in the conversation. That's critical.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, we're now going to transition to a question and answer period and give you in the audience a chance to ask Ari and Aaron your questions. And I'm going to start off with a rather complex question that someone has asked. And it's really regarding the 2020 Baltimore Jewish Community Study. There is a statement and a footnote in that study that has to do with the number of Jewish adults in Baltimore who identify with a racial category other than non-Hispanic white. And it says that about 8% of Jewish adults in Baltimore would fall into that category. That's followed up with a footnote that says that the study itself, the Baltimore Jewish Community Study, suggests that 1% of Jewish adults identify as a person of color. And then it goes on to say, but there's something called a confidence interval where the two estimates overlap. I know we're back to the same old question. It's how many Jews of color are there in Baltimore? What does this mean? Why is there how can there be such a variation between 1% and 8%? And I would say that if you're at all familiar, of course, with the Jews of Color Initiative, they would say the number's probably higher than the 8%. So why is there all of this variation?
So I happen to have a slide that has the relevant data on it. So I'm just going to pull it up here so everybody can see it, because we're going to get in the weeds, sort of deeper in the weeds here. So I said before, there was one question that was asked on the survey: do you identify as a person of color? The finding on page 83 of the report says approximately 8% of Jewish adults in Baltimore identify with a racial category other than non-Hispanic white. Then there's a footnote. The text of the footnote says the data from the American Jewish Population Project suggests that the 8% comes from the American Jewish Population Project. The actual responses in the Baltimore Jewish Community Study says 1%. So why the discrepancy? It's a great question. The discrepancy, I think, has to do with the sampling frame, which is the Baltimore Jewish Study, and I checked this during our conversation. Built their sampling frame from the combined mailing lists of Jewish organizations in Baltimore and Howard County, because they didn't have a random digit dialing frame. They couldn't do a random sample of people. So they just sampled from the combined mailing lists of Jewish organizations. So they only, it appears, and that they only surveyed people who were on the membership lists of Jewish organizations in the community. So if I'm a Jew who lives in Baltimore, but I don't belong to any Jewish organization, I wasn't even invited to take the study in the first place. So it's a limited frame. The American Jewish Population Project is a massive undertaking by my colleagues at Brandeis, who incidentally are the same people who did the associated study at the Steinhardt Social Research Institute. They did the American Jewish Population Project. The American Jewish Population Project's data come from national studies of all kinds, ABC News polls, Nielsen polls, like general polls of Americans, in which they ask, what is your religion? And the AJPP has pulled out all the responses from all of the people who identified Judaism as their religion, and has done a sub-analysis has basically taken the responses from all those studies, pulled them together, pulled out all of the Jewish respondents from the respondents who identified Judaism as their religion, and has done a subsequent meta-analysis of that subset of respondents to these other big national studies. And from there, the American Jewish Population Project estimated or found about between 11.2 and 11.8% of American Jews are identify as Jews of color. So nationally, that's a national portrait, and we know that things are different on the local level. That's how they came up with that number. Counting inconsistencies, that's a report that Aaron and I wrote with Aaliyah, our colleague at Stanford. Counting inconsistencies, it's a bit higher than that, because the AJPP's estimate was only people who identify with Judaism as their religion. And we know, we did an analysis of the Jews of color in the 2013 Pew report, and we found that Jews of color are much less likely to identify Judaism as their religion and still identify as a Jew. And so we thought that 11.2% or 11.8% was actually low, so we went higher as an estimate nationally. How it is that the AJPP said 8%, but the local Baltimore study said 1%, and then they said, well, let's go with the 8%. You'll have to ask my colleagues at Brandeis to dig in and how they came up with that precise number, because all I have is the documentation from the report, which is the same thing that you all have. But it's interesting to me that the actual study of Baltimore gave them 1%, and they said, no, this national portrait is actually a better representation at 8%. But it's probably, my guess is, because of the religion, non-religion thing, it's probably a bit higher than that, even so. That was a really geeky answer, but
we have a question from someone who wants to know, how has your critique, how have demographers reacted to your critique of their studies?
So they've reacted differently. I'm not going to name names right here. I've gotten some notes from friends, from colleagues who said that they just wished it was, I mean, I'll be totally transparent here, that they wished that our report was cleaner than it had been, the counting inconsistencies, that it was more comprehensive than it was. I have another colleague who simply said that we were totally off base. That was a kind way of putting words in his mouth. He was not happy at all about our findings. So Aaron and I took the critiques that me and Aaron and Aaliyah found, took the critiques that we thought were constructive, and we've now written a more substantive, broader, deeper analysis of the same phenomenon, and we've documented it extensively, and it's under review at an academic journal. So we feel good about our report. The interesting thing has been the responses from community organizations like the Associated or other federations, which have begun to insist, when they put out the calls for proposals, that race and ethnicity are among the things that they include in community studies coming forward. And frankly, that is within the context of this particular project. That's all we want. We want change at that level.
I also think that there's some questions here about who ought to be responsible for expanding this issue so that it does appear in more studies. I think a lot of the people are having trouble digesting the fact that they're looking for who has to be responsible to ask the question and make sure the questions get included in the studies. I think a lot of people seem to have trouble understanding why that's necessary. Can either of you address that?
I'd say all of us are responsible, right? To some degree. Right? Abraham Joshua Heschel's famous comment, some are guilty, all are responsible. I'd say if you are part of a given community, it is your responsibility to bring certain issues to that community. Now, when you're talking about a community that's millions of people, that's its size, it's hard to get your thoughts to the person who it could actually change their behavior. But that's part of the challenge in all facets of societal change. Yeah.
There's another question here too about this notion of Jews of color and the confusion that it seems to lead to. This person is asking, are you talking about only African Americans as Jews of color? Are you referring to Sephardic Jews as Jews of color? And I think what you've been saying is the surveys depend upon self-identification. That's sort of the critical element a person needs to understand. Can you give any further comment on what the self-identification means and why that's really the means by which surveys are conducted?
So when we're talking about our particular corner of this conversation is about survey instruments and survey reports. And so we're interested in the ways that the surveys construct the questions and the ways the surveys construct the categories. And as Aaron was saying before, the way that those questions and those categories construct realities. The surveys don't reflect realities, they construct realities, which makes them very powerful. And so our job, when you were talking before about who's responsible, I think Aaron is right, we're all responsible. The lever that Aaron and Aaliyah and I can push on is the ability to talk to our colleagues and the ability to talk to the organized Jewish community and say, the way that these surveys have been constructed has been, with respect to race and ethnicity, has been slapdash, has been uneven, has been inconsistent, and has perpetuated the portrait of American Jews as predominantly or presumptively white. And they haven't done en masse, they have not done an adequate job of trying to recognize and account for the presence of non-Ashkenazi, non-white Jews in those communities, regardless. And here I take a step back. Regardless of how those Jews identify. Somebody asked a question about, what about Persian Jews? Only 16 of the surveys asked a question about Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi. I don't recall Persian being a word there. And I know some Persian Jews who identify as people of color. I know other Persian Jews who don't. Some Mizrahi Jews and Sephardi Jews do identify as Jews of color. Some don't. The term itself is quite contested. But the way that it works out in survey land is by self-report. Just like I wouldn't say, if I was writing a survey, I wouldn't try to impose my perspectives on what a person, on anything about my interview subject. I would want the interview subject to represent themselves in the best way possible. So as a survey administrator, it's not my job to say, oh, you drive to synagogue on Shabbat, but you keep kosher out of the house, but not in the house, you're probably a Reform Jew. That's not my place. My place is to say, what denomination do you identify with? And for that person to say, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, just Jewish, whatever. And I feel like the same amount, so by comparison to the 31 studies that asked about Jews of color, or asked about race or ethnicity, all 76 studies asked about Jewish denomination. That was important enough to include in every single study. And so our question, the purpose of our research and our particular corner of responsibility that we can assert here is to ask that Jewish communities in the United States take as much care to ask about racial and ethnic identity as they do to ask about other things that are included in every single one of these community studies, and to take the same amount of care with the construction of the questions and with the attention to the diversity of identities within those communities.
I'm going to ask one last question, and that is, if the two of you could make a few recommendations to the Baltimore Jewish community about how do you think the studies, what needs to be added to those studies so that you can really get a firm handle on just how many Jews of color there are? What would you recommend that the Jewish communities undertake to get an answer to that question?
I'd say for starters, use the guidelines that were set up in 1997, which are somewhat outdated themselves, but the federal guidelines in the two-part question that at least would, if this city of Cleveland and New Orleans and San Francisco and LA, if they were asking similar questions about a particular subgroup within Jews, then at least we could add up those figures and have a better understanding of the national representation of that subgroup of Jews. I'd say for starters.
I would say, I would take a step back even from Aaron's, and I would say, if we're talking about the aggregate of all these studies that have been done since the year 2000, let's start by asking the questions, right? The majority of studies didn't even ask a single question, not a single question. So let's start by making sure that those questions are included. Then we can talk about what form those questions ought to take. The OMB guidelines that Aaron was talking about, written in 1997, are not unproblematic, but they do allow you to do certain things when it comes to comparing or compiling other studies and other data sets that are going to allow you to derive and calculate and sort of compensate for bad sampling, which is my third point, which is they need to sample better. In any community, Baltimore or otherwise, sampling off of, trying to run a population sample off of member lists of communities. We all know Jews who don't belong to Jewish organizations. I am one, right? We all know Jews who don't belong to Jewish organizations. We can imagine that Jews with minoritized identities are less likely to join those organizations. So if you're doing a population study that you would like to be representative of that community, you got to do better on the sampling as well. So I would say you got to ask the question, you got to ask questions in consistent ways, and you got to sample better.
Trillian, over to you.
Thank you, Abe, and thank you everyone for taking us through such a fascinating and complicated discussion. So thank you all. So just a couple of quick reminders to wrap us up for this evening. As you head out of the program this evening, you're going to be directed to a survey. If you can please just take a couple minutes to fill in that survey for us. It is really, really helpful for us as we continue to plan additional programs and conversations as we go forward. There are going to be a couple of links popping up in the chat for you in 1 minute, and we'll make sure we keep the program open so you've got time to grab them. So the first one that should have popped up there is a link where you can register for the other programs coming up in this series, the next one of which will be on December 20th with a conversation between Abe again and Rabbi Mejia. And you can also go back there and have a look at some of the conversations that we've already had in this series. I think some of them were absolutely fascinating. If you didn't get a chance to hear Harriet speak a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Wims, who introduced the program today, her conversation was just amazing. So I strongly recommend you find time to go back and listen to that conversation. Also in the chat, you will see an email address. So the team over at Hizkiah Emunah have got available and ready for your purchase copies of Judaism's A 21st Century Introduction to Jews and Jewish Identities by Aaron Hahn Tapper, our speaker today. And there's Abe holding up a copy for you. It is a fantastic book and well worth the read. So please reach out to Hizkiah. And then also the final link that we've got in there for you is a link to some further reading that you might find interesting if you would like to continue exploring this subject. So have a little look there. I think the whole team today helped put together that list of additional reading, a couple of the pieces we've sort of seen referenced in the chat as well. So again, well worth having a look at that. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to everybody for joining us in this virtual world. And just thank you again to Abe, Gail, Aaron, and Ari. Thank you so much for taking us through such a fascinating conversation, and have a good evening, everybody. Thank you.